On December 27, 2025, while most Americans celebrated the holiday season, something extraordinary happened in Kyiv. Something the Western media barely mentioned. Something that reveals with crystalline clarity the true nature of what Washington calls diplomacy. Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking publicly about the ongoing peace negotiations, proposed holding a national referendum on Trump's plan, a basic democratic exercise. The Ukrainian people voting on their own future sounds reasonable, doesn't it? But here's the detail Washington doesn't want you to notice. Zelensky conditioned this referendum on a 60-day Russian ceasefire, and Moscow's response, Putin had already indicated weeks earlier that he might consider a one-day ceasefire and a single day to allow for the electoral process. Let me repeat that. Ukraine asks for 60 days. Russia offered 1 day, and somehow, in Washington's narrative, it's Moscow that's being intransigent. I've watched American foreign policy for over 4 decades. I've taught thousands of students about great power dynamics, and I can say without hesitation, what's happening in the negotiations over Ukraine isn't diplomacy. It's deliberate sabotage disguised as a peace process. Let me take you through the chronology, because the real story begins long before December 2025. In 2014, Washington orchestrated regime change in Kyiv. Don't take my word for it. Take Victoria Nuland's, then Assistant Secretary of State, caught on tape discussing exactly who should be in the new Ukrainian government. Fuck the EU, she said when the Europeans hesitated about the speed of the coup. That wasn't diplomacy. That was regime engineering, pure and simple. Russia reacted by annexing Crimea. Washington called it unprovoked aggression. But let's be clear about the causal sequence. The United States overthrew an elected government on Russia's border, installed a regime openly hostile to Moscow, and then expressed shock when Russia secured its naval base in Sevastopol. The logic is identical to what Washington used in 1962 when it placed missiles in Turkey, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The only difference is perspective. Fast forward to 2021-2022. Russia, watching NATO's continued eastward expansion despite all the verbal assurances given to Gorbachev in 1990, presented formal security proposals. It asked for written guarantees that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. It asked for a new European security architecture that included Russia, not one directed against it. Washington refused to even negotiate seriously. In February 2022, Russia invaded. And yes, it was an invasion. But asking why Russia invaded without examining 30 years of NATO expansion, broken Western promises, and refusal to negotiate security architecture is like asking why Pearl Harbor happened without mentioning the American oil embargo on Japan. Since then, Washington has poured weapons into Ukraine, not to help Ukraine win. The Pentagon's own leaked documents made clear a Ukrainian victory was never considered realistic, but to bleed Russia, to weaken Moscow, to keep Ukraine fighting to the last. Now we arrive at December 2025, and here's where the mathematics reveals the lie. In the summer of 2025, Zelensky mentioned a 600,000 strong army as the goal. When serious negotiations began, that number magically became 800,000. Meanwhile, Russia's own estimates suggest the Ukrainian military currently has between 60,000 and 80,000 operational soldiers. Do you understand what this means? These aren't just numbers on a page. This is a generation of young Ukrainians, dead, maimed, traumatized. For what? To keep Ukraine as a Western spearhead against Russia? I visited the region in 2019. I spoke with ordinary people in Donetsk, in Luhansk. They didn't want war. They wanted dignity, cultural autonomy, the right to speak Russian without being called traitors. But Washington wasn't interested in self-determination for Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Washington was interested in transforming Ukraine into a geopolitical asset. And now, Hospitals in Kyiv struggle with medical supplies, not because of Russian bombs, but because of Western economic sanctions that disrupted regional supply chains. Pensioners in Mariupol, on both sides of the front line, live with economies destroyed by financial warfare as much as by kinetic war. Children grow up without fathers. But in Washington's narrative, this is all Russia's fault. And then we have the farce of European security guarantees. France, always eager to play the role of important power while lacking any real power to back it up, announced 3 layers of guarantees for Ukraine. First layer, a robust Ukrainian army with long-term Western support. But robust means what exactly? 80,000 soldiers, 800,000, and who will pay for it? European taxpayers, already facing economic recession because of anti-Russian sanctions that hurt Europe far more than Moscow. Second layer, Western coalition forces present in Ukraine as a strategic show of support. And here's the revealing part. Without combat involvement, without ceasefire monitoring, just symbolic presence, theater, posture without substance. Third layer, NATO Article 5 style guarantees from the United States. But anyone who it's actually read Article 5 knows it's deliberately vague. It says an attack on one member will be considered an attack on all, but leaves each country to decide its own response. It's not an automatic guarantee. It's a letter of intent, not a blank check. And Trump made it perfectly clear he doesn't have anything until I approve it. Translation: Washington will keep Ukraine in suspense, dependent, vulnerable, exactly how it prefers its allies. Here's where the entire narrative collapses. Sergei Ryabkov, Russia's deputy foreign minister, made a statement that should have been headline news everywhere but was largely ignored by Western media. We know this plan, he said about the 2-point proposal being negotiated between Ukraine and the United States. It radically differs from the 27 points we've been working through with the Americans since early December. But the political will to remain within the framework established in Anchorage isn't just fundamental for us, it's imperative. We cannot exceed these limits. Otherwise, there won't just be an unstable agreement. There will be no agreement at all. Let me decode this for you. Russia and the United States, Putin and Trump, negotiated a framework in Anchorage, Alaska, an agreement on principles, a path to peace. But then Washington went back to the negotiating table with Ukraine and produced a completely different plan, a plan that fundamentally contradicts what was agreed with Moscow. And when Ryabkov talks about political will to remain within the Anchorage framework, he's jabbing at Trump. He's saying, you know what we agreed to, but you're allowing this Ukrainian-American farce to derail everything. Why? Because Washington never wanted peace. Washington wants to perpetuate the conflict. It wants to keep Russia bleeding, Europe dependent on American security, and Ukraine as a permanently militarized buffer zone. Let me take you back to 1962. The Soviet Union started placing missiles in Cuba. Washington's response? Naval blockade, threat of nuclear war, absolute demands for missile removal, and the American justification, national security. No great power can tolerate hostile weapons on its border. The logic was impeccable, and Washington was right. Now fast forward to 2025, NATO has expanded to include all of the former Soviet allies in Eastern Europe. It's placing missile systems in Poland and Romania. It's training Ukrainian forces and supplying advanced weapons miles from Russia's border. And when Moscow protests, when it presents security proposals, when it finally acts to prevent Ukraine's NATO membership, Washington calls it unprovoked aggression. The logic is identical. The only difference is perspective. Washington justified the Cuban Missile Crisis based on legitimate security concerns. Moscow justifies its actions in Ukraine on exactly the same grounds. But in the Western narrative, when Washington does it, it's national security. When Moscow does it, it's imperialism. But here's what Washington doesn't understand, or perhaps understands perfectly and is too terrified to admit. Every sanction the US imposes on Russia pushes Moscow further into Beijing's arms. Every threat to Russian security accelerates Sino-Russian integration. Every attempt to isolate Moscow strengthens the BRICS' determination to build alternative financial systems. In 2015, SWIFT was unquestionable. The American dollar was indispensable. Western financial institutions controlled global trade. In 2025, Russia and China increasingly conduct trade in their own currencies. The BRICS has expanded to include Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. Alternative payment systems are processing trillions in trade without ever touching Western banks. Washington weaponized the dollar, and in doing so gave the rest of the world every reason to seek alternatives. American coercion isn't creating compliance. It's creating resistance coalitions. It's accelerating the transition to a multipolar world. It's ending the American unipolar moment faster than any external adversary ever could. Let's return to Zelensky's referendum. He wants 60 days. Moscow offered one. Zelensky wants to vote on a 2-point plan that radically differs from what Russia agreed to. Moscow says it cannot exceed the Anchorage framework. Do you see the pattern? The goalposts keep moving. First it was general elections, then a referendum on territory, now a referendum on the entire peace plan. And each time the goalposts move, the gap with Russia's position widens. This isn't accident, this is design. Because if the referendum happens and the Ukrainian people vote for peace on Russian terms, Washington loses its proxy war. But if the referendum never happens because the preconditions are impossible, then Washington can continue supplying weapons, maintaining the war, bleeding Russia indefinitely. The referendum is theater. Ukrainian democracy is staging. The real decision, whether Ukraine makes peace or continues fighting, will be made in Washington, not Kiev. So here we are. Washington negotiated a framework with Moscow and Anchorage, then allowed Ukraine to present a contradictory plan. France promises security guarantees that are mostly symbolic. Zelensky proposes a referendum conditional on prerequisites. Russia's already rejected, and Trump says nothing is approved until he approves it. Meanwhile, young Ukrainians die. Russian pensioners suffer. European families freeze in winters without cheap Russian gas. And why? To maintain American hegemony over a Europe that no longer wants to be a vassal. Here's what Washington doesn't understand. You cannot build peace on lies. You cannot negotiate in good faith while simultaneously sabotaging the process. You cannot demand that Russia accept European security that explicitly means Russian exclusion and containment. The choice is simple. Genuine shared security or competing armed blocs. Multipolar architecture or unipolar domination. Coexistence or confrontation. The mask is slipped, the hegemon is cracking, and every day that Washington refuses genuine negotiation is a day more. People die to maintain an international order that has already expired. The clock is ticking, not for Trump's approval or Zelensky's conditions, but by the simple logic that you cannot bleed two nuclear powers indefinitely and expect history to be on your side. The world is watching, and increasingly, the world is choosing alternatives to the US-led order that has brought only sanctions, wars, and subordination. Peace was possible in Anchorage. It's still possible today, but it requires something Washington seems incapable of offering: the willingness to treat other great powers as equals, not as subordinates. The future will unfold in the coming months, not in Florida's meeting rooms, but on Ukraine's battlefields and in the boardrooms of Beijing, Moscow, Brasilia, and Riyadh, where the alternative order is being built brick by brick. The American era is ending, not because adversaries defeated it, but because Washington chose coercion over cooperation, domination over dignity, and perpetual war over shared peace. History is watching, and its judgment will be severe,